The temperature in Seattle dropped to -12 on the night of December 14th, 2008. That number needs a little context because Seattle doesn't do -12. The city hasn't recorded a night that cold in 30 years. The people who track weather data wrote about it afterward, with the specific tone that meteorologists use when the numbers surprise even them. Matter of fact on the surface, something else underneath. On that night, in a gravel lot off East Marginal Way South along the Duwamish Waterway, there was a 1979 Chris Craft cabin cruiser sitting on jack stands with its hull aimed at the sky, cracked engine housing tarped over, a length of wire running from the stern toward a panel box on a wooden post. The kind of thing you walk past in a salvage yard and barely register. The interior temperature that night was 54 degrees. Calvin Marsh was 41 years old. He was in a sleeping bag, reading a library paperback by the light of a clip-on LED lamp, listening to a small diesel heater run at low output somewhere behind the forward bulkhead. Outside, -12. Inside, 54. 66 degrees of separation between the air trying to kill you and the air he was breathing. He'd been inside the boat since October. He'd seen this night coming since the weather turned in November, and when it finally arrived, the coldest night in a generation for that city, it found him exactly as prepared as he'd planned to be. This is how he got there. The Duwamish Waterway is not the Seattle people picture when they picture Seattle. No hills, no coffee shops, no views. It runs south out of Elliott Bay through the industrial back of the city, port terminals, food processing plants, metal recyclers, marine salvage yards. The smell of the water down here is different from the sound. Heavier, more diesel, more industry. The kind of neighborhood that gets work done and doesn't make a show of it. Dave Hargrove had been running a marine salvage operation off East Marginal Way for 16 years. He was 61, retired from Foss Maritime after decades on tugboats. He ran the lot with the organizational method of a man who keeps everything in his head and resents being asked to explain it. He knew what every piece of equipment was worth, what it had come off of, and whether it was worth the trouble of fixing. The Chris Craft was in the back corner, and it was not worth the trouble. It had come in the previous spring, hauled out of Lake Union after a cracked engine block, took it past the point of economical repair. The original owner paid the tow bill, signed over the title, and walked away. Dave had listed it twice. No serious inquiries. Calvin came to him in October 2008, not to buy it. He asked if he could live in it. Dave said no. Then he said he'd think about it. Then he said yes if Calvin kept the lot tidy and was gone by 6 when he opened. He expected him to last 2 weeks before he found something better, or gave up on the idea entirely. Calvin had spent 12 years as a marine systems technician. That job title covers anyone who services what lives inside a boat that isn't the engine itself: bilge pumps, electrical panels, through-hull fittings, ventilation systems, heating units, holding tanks. The infrastructure that keeps a vessel functional between the more visible parts. He'd worked the Puget Sound ferry routes for a service contractor that held the maintenance agreements on 3 of the smaller inter-island lines. Not the Washington State ferries directly, but the company that kept their secondary fleet operational. He knew the sound the way you know a neighborhood you've worked in for years. Which terminals had shelter from the northwest wind, which routes ran into condensation problems in the forward passenger compartments, what temperatures did to marine sealant before it had fully cured. And he knew, in specific and applied terms, how boats lose and hold heat. That knowledge was not theoretical. He'd logged temperature data on enclosed vessels in October weather on the Sound, small diesel heating units holding 55 degrees inside a fiberglass cabin, while the outside air sat in the mid-30s. He'd written the fuel consumption numbers in his job notebooks. Yeah, he understood what the geometry of a small sealed space does to a heating load. The service company lost its ferry contract in the summer of 2008. One of those situations where the municipality went with a lower bid on renewal, 12% cheaper, and 7 service accounts disappeared inside 6 months. Calvin got 2 weeks' notice in July. He spent the next 3 months applying to other contractors and got 4 interviews, no offers. By October, the housing math didn't work anymore. He was not someone who narrated his own circumstances in dramatic terms. When he described that period later, he described it the way a mechanic describes a diagnosis. Here's what happened, here's why, here's what the situation required. What it required was a place to get through the winter. He looked at the Chris Craft and he saw a place. Let me explain what Calvin understood about that boat that most people standing in the same lot would have missed entirely. Fiberglass doesn't conduct heat. That sounds simple. The implications take a minute to work through. Metal conducts heat the way copper wire conducts electricity, efficiently, continuously, in both directions. A steel hull in cold air is essentially a radiator running in reverse, pulling warmth out of the inside and handing it to the outside at a rate that no small heater can fully keep up with. This is why sleeping in an uninsulated metal van or truck in a Montana winter is a losing battle if your only strategy is to generate more heat. The structure itself is working against you. Fiberglass is a plastic matrix reinforced with glass fiber. Plastic has thermal conductivity roughly 100 times lower than steel. A fiberglass hull in cold air is not a great insulator. The R value on a stock boat hull sits around 2, which is about what you get from a single pane of glass, but it is a dramatically better starting point than any metal structure of the same weight. You're not fighting the walls. The walls are at least not actively fighting you. Calvin knew this. He'd serviced heating units on fiberglass vessels and logged what they could do. He also knew that the cabin of a 26-foot cruiser is roughly 80 square feet. In thermal terms, that's useful. Small enclosed spaces retain heat more efficiently than large ones. For the same reason a sleeping bag works better than a blanket. The geometry is working for you. What the boat needed, he decided, was foam board, closed cell panels, cut to follow the curve of the interior hull, adhered to the surface to bring the effective R value from 2 up to something around 10. Not spectacular, but paired with the right heat source, in a space that small, enough. There was also the condensation question, which on a boat is never not a question. A human body breathing in an enclosed space overnight generates more moisture than most people realize, and warm air hitting a cold surface gives it up immediately. Calvin had spent 12 years watching what moisture does to a boat that isn't managed. He was not going to let this one rot from the inside while he was living in it. Dave walked through the cabin once in early November. He stood at the entrance and looked at the foam board Calvin had fitted along the forward bulkhead, cut to follow the hull curve, adhered, joints taped with foil HVAC tape. He said, "That adhesive is going to let go when the temperature swings." Calvin told him the adhesive was rated to -40 and was the same product used on refrigerated cargo holds. Dave said, "Huh?" and walked out. He wasn't hostile about it. He was doing what experienced people do when they're watching someone attempt something they think will fail, giving it enough attention to be able to say, "I told you so" later, but not enough to actually engage with the reasoning. There was a guy named Terry who ran the scrap metal operation 2 properties over and came through the lot occasionally. He saw the boat in mid-November and told Calvin he was living in the world's worst cruise ship, which was genuinely funny. Calvin laughed at it. Terry used it as a greeting every time after that. Calvin didn't argue with Terry. Arguing was not going to make the boat warmer. The work took 3 weeks, mostly early mornings and evenings before Dave opened the lot. He started with the foam board, 2-inch closed cell sheets from a building material salvage yard in Sodo, $30 worth, enough to cover the interior hull surface from the waterline to the deckhead. Fiberglass hulls curve in 2 directions at once in places, and getting flat panels to follow that curve without leaving gaps is a patience exercise. He scored the backing and bent each panel to match the hull, fitting them 1 section at a time. The sealant went in after, marine-grade polyurethane, applied at every joint, smoothed with a gloved finger, the same way he'd bet a through hull on a ferry maintenance job. The goal was to eliminate every path that warm, moist interior air could travel toward a cold surface. The heating system was the part he was most confident about from the start. The Chris Craft still had its fuel tank, a 30-gallon stainless unit bolted under the forward berth, intact, fittings still good. The original fuel lines had been disconnected at the engine, but the tank itself accepted a standard replacement line. He ran it to a small diesel heater pulled from the salvage yard's parts inventory, a unit off a decommissioned charter boat, functional but unsaleable as stock. available to him for the cost of clearing the shelf space it occupied. The heater vented through a fitting he installed in the aft cabin bulkhead. Intake came through a port he left cracked on the leeward side. He tested the system in late October, before the cold arrived, ran it for 2 hours in the evening, tracked the temperature on a small thermometer mounted on the forward bulkhead, checked every hour, wrote the readings in a pocket notebook. Interior at 10 p.m., 62 degrees. Outside, 38. Interior at 2 a.m. Heater off for 4 hours, 54. Outside, 31. The gap held. The foam was working. No visible condensation. He closed the notebook and went to sleep. I want to stop here for a second before we get to December. Calvin spent 3 weeks of early mornings doing careful, deliberate work in a salvage yard. A man who knew more about boats than almost anyone in Seattle came through once and was skeptical. The guy next door had a cruise ship joke. The general assumption from everyone who saw the project was that he was improvising toward an uncomfortable winter. He knew he wasn't. He had the thermometer readings. He had 12 years of exactly this kind of work. Here's what I keep coming back to. At what point does other people's skepticism stop mattering to you? Is it the first test result? Or is it earlier, when you're confident enough in the reasoning that the test is just documentation and the outcome already feels settled in your head? Leave that in the comments. I'm genuinely asking. I don't have a clean answer, and I find the question more interesting than most people give it credit for. Here's something that doesn't usually make it into this kind of story. In early November, Calvin woke to find condensation on the inside face of the door, between the cabin and the cockpit, not on the foam panels, on the door. The original teak door that came with the boat, uninsulated, hung in a wooden frame. He stood looking at it for a while. The door was a thermal bridge, warm interior air, reaching a cold surface and surrendering its moisture there. He'd addressed every surface of the hull and hadn't thought about the door. The foam was perfect, the hull was sealed, and there was a cold wood rectangle sitting in the middle of it, doing exactly what a cold surface does. It took an afternoon to fix. Foam tape along the frame, a sheet of closed cell foam adhered to the interior face of the door with contact cement, a threshold strip at the bottom where the gap was widest, less than $20, maybe an hour of actual work. Next morning, nothing. Door was dry. He wrote in the notebook, "Door fixed. Should have done this first." The habit of writing down what he got wrong mattered as much as writing down the temperature readings. That was something he'd carried from the service trade. A job log that only records successes is a story you're telling yourself. A real log includes what you missed and when you caught it. He caught it in week 3 instead of January. Well, that was good enough. Seattle had its second coldest December in 30 years in 2008. The region is usually moderated. Pacific air off the Sound keeps winters mild, and most years the temperatures stay in the 30s and low 40s, which is cold if you're sleeping outside, but not the kind of cold that tests what things are actually made of. December 2008 was different. A high-pressure system came down from British Columbia and parked itself there. The air it brought had nothing of the Pacific in it. By the second week of December, the overnight lows were in the low teens. By the third week, single digits. On the 13th, the forecast for overnight showed -12 by 4 in the morning. Calvin checked it at the library. He walked back to the lot. He filled the diesel tank from a 5-gallon jerry can he kept stored on the premises. That evening, he ran the heater for 3 hours, watched the interior temperature climb to 68, backed it off to low burn around 10, turned it off at 11. Then he got in his sleeping bag and read until midnight. At 4 in the morning, the thermometer on the forward bulkhead read 54 degrees. The official overnight low at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport recorded -12.3, the lowest temperature in the city's recorded weather history. 54 inside, -12 outside. 66 degrees of difference held through the night by a fiberglass hull, 2 inches of closed cell foam, a properly sealed door, marine sealant at every joint, and a diesel heater that had been switched off 5 hours before. He wrote the number in the notebook, underlined it once, put the notebook back on the shelf above the port berth. Then he made coffee on the camp stove and waited for Dave to open the lot. Dave was a little late that morning. The lock on the gate had stiffened in the cold. Calvin was outside when he pulled in, waiting with 2 cups. Dave took one, stood there in his coat. He asked what the interior temperature had been. Calvin showed him the notebook. Dave looked at the overnight reading and the exterior reading written alongside it. He did the subtraction in his head. He said, "That's better than my house was last night." Calvin didn't have much to say to that. The number already said it. Dave called him the following week and told him he could stay through spring. He didn't explain the change. Calvin didn't ask him to. An outreach worker named Patricia Solis. She worked with a nonprofit connecting people from the maritime trades to stable employment, heard about Calvin through one of the yard's part-time staff and came to the lot in January. Patricia asked Calvin to write down what he'd done, foam board type and thickness, adhesive specs, sealant application sequence, ventilation setup, fuel consumption data from 6 weeks of notebook entries. Calvin wrote 4 pages longhand at the library, formatted like a job report, materials list, application sequence, correction notes, temperature logs, the kind of document you hand to a supervisor, not a post you put online. Patricia distributed it through her network. It reached 3 other marine salvage operations around Puget Sound. A version ended up in a cold weather preparedness document circulated through maritime trades employment programs in early 2009. In February, Calvin got a call from a marine contractor running maintenance on 3 commercial fishing vessels out of Westport. They needed a systems technician who knew Puget Sound and had hands-on experience with diesel heating in confined spaces. He'd spent a winter developing exactly that. He left the boat in April. The foam panels stayed, the door insulation stayed, the heater stayed operational, and Dave kept it that way for the next 2 people who needed what Calvin had needed. Here's something about working on boats that doesn't translate easily. A boat is never finished. It's always moving, even at the dock. The wood expands and contracts, the sealant compresses and relaxes, the metal breathes with the temperature. The job of a marine systems technician is not to stop things from changing. It's to stay ahead of what's changing and address it before it becomes a problem. You check, you log, you seal the thing that needs sealing before the water finds it, right? Because water always finds it. And the difference between a small repair and a serious one is entirely about how long you waited. Calvin's notebook was a maintenance log. He was maintaining the system the same way he'd maintained every system he'd worked on for 12 years, checking the readings, noting the deviations, correcting what needed correcting before it became a failure. The cold was just another system behaving according to its rules. He already knew the rules. There is a kind of knowledge that doesn't care about the context it's carried in. It doesn't care whether you're working on a ferry in active service or a broken Chris craft in a salvage lot. The hull is still trying to conduct heat outward. The foam is still slowing that down. The cold is still looking for the gaps. He'd close the gaps. That's the whole story. That's all it ever was. If you watch this to the end, you already know whether this channel is for you. We're not here to make you feel bad about a broken system. We're here for people who want to understand how the systems work. Thermal barriers, vessel insulation, moisture management in tight spaces, heat sources that don't require you to run an engine all night. The Street Survival Solutions Field Guide is linked in the description. It covers the principles behind what Calvin was working through in a format you can use before you need it. There's another story on this channel waiting. Different structure, different city, different material, same kind of thinking. It's there whenever you're ready.